Um, Today I want to talk to you about the logic of causal thinking in health sciences. And all of us here have background in health sciences with different, of course, many different backgrounds. Some of you are in clinical sciences, some of you in nursing, some of you in public health and medicine. But together, what we're all focused on is, well, we're all part of the same group, is in health sciences. Now, so this lecture, I want to talk you through some of the fundamental principles of causal thinking in epidemiology. It's, I know all of you have, given your backgrounds, you've already had some experience or some teaching around this topic. I'm not here to repeat what you already know. So I want to really start by asking you a question. How do you know something? How do you, anyone here, how do you know something to be true? How do you know that the three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees? How do you know that a traffic light goes from green to amber to red? When did you learn that? How is it that you know that? How is it that you know that diet can prevent disease? When did that happen that you learned it? All of the things that you know, where did it come from? There's many different ways of knowing in the world. I want to talk to you today about three non-scientific ways, and then we'll talk about the scientific ways. So there's many ways in which you can know something. And the three scientific ways is, the first of the non-scientific ways is what's called the method of authority. If you think about all of human existence from the beginning of human societies, this is the main way in which people knew something to be true. This is the number one way. Something is true because someone in authority said it's true. In all of human history, that's the case. 95% of human society, you know something's true because the king said it, the imam said it, the priest said it, the school teacher said it, or the professor said it. Your doctor said it. Someone in authority who had access to the knowledge told you it was true. And for all sorts of reasons, the great majority of people in the world were never educated. They for most of the time, couldn't read or write, had no other alternative way of learning. There was no books, let alone no internet. It was only those who were educated and in positions of authority, whether that was religious authority or cultural authority or feudal lord authority, whether they were monarchs, were the ones that would say things, dictate what was true, and then you knew that to be true because they said it. That's another way of knowing, which has also been around for a very long time, is what's called the method of tenacity. Something is true because it's always been true. Mental illness is a sign that evil spirits are in the soul. That's always been true, except for the last maybe 100 years. Is it true? But for thousands and thousands of years, yes, that was true. No question. Or your mental illness was caused by your ancestors who were upset with you. Or something you did in a previous life. The earth is flat. The earth is flat, definitely. Because all of the knowledge of all of humankind said the earth is flat. The method of tenacity is it's true because it's always known to be true. Diet can prevent disease. People have known that since the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the ancient Greeks have known that diet can prevent disease. It's always been known. It's been known for as long as people have known that the earth is flat. The method of tenacity means that this concept is tenacious. It hangs on. It stays. Now, of course, some things that people know to be true because they've always been true, of course, are not true. Our task as scientists is to try and work out which is which. Another way of knowing something that's non-scientific is intuition. Believing something is true because it feels right. You judge something by the clarity of the experience, not by your book learning or what you learned to be a fact, what you logically worked out to be correct. You know it to be true because it feels right. Knowing or sensing without the use of rational logical processes, immediate cognition. Examples is clinical intuition. If you've worked as a doctor, if you've worked as a midwife or as a nurse, you know sometimes in an emergency situation when you are right on the spot, you must do something immediately, and you do this because it feels right. Because it's a feeling more than a memory or a skill. It's intuition. Now, hopefully you're a good enough clinician that your intuition and your skill are pretty close. But often they're not the same. So, but, you know, intuition also comes from artistic imagining and poetry, and it could be maternal instinct. Much of mothering and fathering is not logical. It's not a conclusion based upon training. Of course not. Much of it is instinctual. It's intuition. So, you know, there are times when you make judgments about what you immediately feel about a patient, as I said before, rather than you know what you know as a fact. You can know something through artistic expression as well. When you see good art, when you listen to good music, you know it, and something profound is being shown or said, you know that to be true because it feels right. You know it to be true that it captures something that's fundamental. There's music, there's painting. It's fundamental in the human condition. You know it to be true. When you see it or hear it, you understand it. So, for example, in The Scream by Edvard Munch in 1893, it's not as entirely clear in this image, but if you've seen that image up close, you look at that face and you realise, sorry, that you realise that Munch defined how many people saw his time in 1893. One of anxiety and fear and uncertainty. So health science is one way of knowing. Now, hopefully, you know, of course, you don't need convincing. It's a very good way of knowing, but not all explanations are scientific. And certainly if you work clinically, you know that a lot of the people that you treat, a lot of the clients you have don't have the same perspectives that you may have. So, what I want to say is that you want to understand cause in science, and you know we want to separate ideas that the human condition is caused by luck, by randomness, by something that's uncontrollable, like an evil spirit, or inherited luck, or inherited bad luck. They're uncontrollable. A disease like the plague going through Europe in the 1600s was uncontrollable. It's chaotic. You want to separate the idea that the human body and disease are like that from that ideas in the human condition is caused by understandable and measurable and potentially controllable events. This is why we have science. We want to understand something and then to control it. That's essentially in epidemiology is almost a definition of epidemiology. So, here's an image I took some years ago, and you can see that in this case, this was in Vietnam, and you can see this was before the introduction of compulsory helmet laws, and there was only this guy here, and everybody else had no helmets. Now, you still see quite a lot of people without helmets, but not that many. You want to move from that to that. You'll notice two things. One, there's a lot of people. Two, all those people have no helmets except one, and nearly all of these people do have helmets. But the traffic chaos is much the same. Right? What you want to do in your health science is the chaos, the unknown risks of the chaotic traffic, which is part and parcel of living in a very densely populated city. There's not a lot you can do about that as an individual, but what you can, as an individual and as a society, is wear helmets. And in this particular country, in Vietnam, when the compulsory helmet law and the policing of wearing of helmets was introduced in 11 years ago, just 11 years ago, that one public health intervention at macro scale, at national scale, for a population of 95 million people, that one public health intervention reduced deaths from traumatic brain injury by 35%. Now, a lot of people still die and are injured through traumatic brain injury, but 1 in every 3 people who otherwise would have died or otherwise would have been permanently disabled through their traffic injury is not. So, what we want to do is ensure that, well, this is a situation in India where I took that from a taxi, from a car, and of course everywhere in India you see such difficult images of workers being transported in such a way. And just when I took that photo, I don't like taking intrusive photos, but I thought, and just as I took it, that young man turned his head and looked directly at me. And I thought, oh. And I just keep it because, like, this was travelling at about 60 kilometres an hour. And, you know, this leads to traumatic brain injury. Every year, about 1.5 million people die in the world, and several million more receive emergency treatment for traumatic brain injury. Now, most of the burden, 90%, is in low and middle income countries. Approximately 20 to 30 million people are severely affected by head injury, mostly acquired on the roads, but often in households or at work. Many more are socially, emotionally and economically affected. Of course, if any of those young men falls off the back of that car, his capacity to work, even if he survives, the capacity to work is probably going to be diminished. His capacity to contribute to the family economic situation is absolutely diminished, and that could mean that his aunt or his mother or his grandmother can't get her antihypertensive medication. It means that maybe his brother can't go to school in many contexts. So the ramifications are absolutely extraordinary. So a lot of people are affected by this. Now, there's been this massive investigation. It's been going on for many years. London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It's called CRASH, the CRASH Trial Investigators. The questions of this is an epidemiological study. The purpose is, you want to ask this question, how can we improve survival amongst people who make it to hospital? And how can we reduce the extent of disability amongst those who survive? How can we do that? It's an important question. So first, as an epidemiologist, what you would do is you start out looking at basic questions. How common is head injury? In epidemiology, you're describing who, where, what, how. And how common is the head injury? In Australia, Europe and the USA, head injury is amongst the leading causes of death. In Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia and many other countries, head injury is one of the leading causes of death before the age of 50. It's a major contributor to personal hardship. Now, so you will start an epidemiological analysis by looking at just basically the distribution. Oh, come on. Okay. So here, you've got hospital admissions. This is from the US, in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. You have a look at the top bar, all right? Very simple graph in epidemiological graph. So there's age across there, and it's the number of people affected. So what do you see in the top? This is blunt head trauma. What do you see? Well, you see, of course, that it mainly affects, the majority of people affected are aged between 15 and 40, okay? Much less so for younger and for older. But then you have a look at traumatic brain injury. So the blunt head trauma is not necessarily causing a traumatic brain injury. And what do you see there? It's quite different. Why would the patterns differ? Why do you think that the young people are more likely, there's more cases of it, right? And then the bottom is a different pattern. It's the prevalence of traumatic brain injury amongst people who have blunt head trauma. Why do you think the risk of blunt head trauma is greater? Yes? Any?
prevalence of traumatic brain injury in the old age and the children.
Yes, yeah.
More susceptible for bleeding.
The more susceptible. Okay. Well, what does more susceptible? What might underlie more susceptible?
Theoretic change between our contents of the blood vessels.
Yep. There could be a biological explanation like that. Yep. It could also be that the head trauma is not as severe in the people in the middle adult years because for reasons such as, external reasons, such as when they fall over or come off a motorbike, more able to protect themselves. Right? Whereas an older person or a child may go straight down and hit the head. Right? Less reaction, less agile. And so my point here is say, okay, we can start with basic epidemiological charts, and from that you can generate questions. The reason you are here is to study health science, and from that, these basic distributions, you can think, okay, what might explain that? And you can come up with various different explanations. It could be the susceptibility for some biological explanation, or it could be agility, it could be other explanations. This was a study that we did in Queensland, in 20 hospitals in Queensland, published it 7 years ago now. What we did was we got data from 384,000 admissions of children, 384,000 admissions of children to 20 hospitals in Queensland over 3 years. And what we looked at was, this is intentional injury. Intentional injury. Intentional. So violence injuries. And so you look at, again, you just have a basic chart like that, basic table, and you have a look and you think, let's compare males and females. When you compare the males and females, you see that the males are much more likely to have trauma of the head. These are all ICD codes, International Classification of Disease codes. Intracranial injury, fractured skull, open wound of the head. And you can see few or no girls have that. The boys do. And then you have a look at the girls. Oops, sorry. And you see that the girls are more likely to be in hospital with reaction to severe stress and adjustment disorders, eating disorders, and depressive episodes. Now, these are all victims of violence. What does that tell you? Well, what you can start to do is think, well, what is the nature of the injuries that boys and girls, what's the differences in the types of injuries that boys and girls have? Typically, girls who are victims of abuse and violence will internalise, maybe become more depressed and self-harming, whereas boys may be externalising. Now, it may not be the actual act of violence that brought them to hospital, but boys who are victims of abuse will often tend to fight and to get involved in violence with other people. And so their injury could be secondary to that. And that's called externalising. In many cultures, it's true that boys will externalise their child abuse experiences where girls will internalise. And you see that this is represented in the intentional injury statistics that come into Queensland hospitals. Right. Epidemiology uses scientifically valid methods to establish causal relationships. What we've said, just that basic graph and the one table, is you can come up with questions, but now we've really got to look for cause and use scientific methods to make progress in that. Now, let's go back to the traumatic brain injury study. Now, in this subject, you're going to learn a lot about epidemiological designs, in particular randomised trials. I know that Philip is particularly keen on that. And so they've got practical exercise as well as lectures about randomised controlled trials or randomised clinical trials. I want to just show you from the beginning, well, the early part of the semester, some results from this crash trial, and we'll see how knowledge evolves as a result of it. So, the question is, does a pharmaceutical drug cause a reduction in death or disability following traumatic head injury? And this has been published in Lancet and British Medical Journal and other journals. And you can read about this. It's an ongoing study at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So the aim was to conduct the largest study in the world, a randomised trial to test the effectiveness of a relatively cheap drug, a corticosteroid called methylprednisolone, and to look at the administration of this drug within 8 hours of head injury. The original intention was to study 20,000 people. 20,000 people. Now, why do such a massive study? 20,000 people. Most research that's done either in hospitals or outside hospitals is much smaller than that. 20,000. Why would you do such a large study? Why would you do it? Mainly because the effect size you're hoping to get from the drug, you're expecting to get from the drug, will be small. It's not a transformative drug. These are people with traumatic brain injury coming into hospital emergency departments, being picked up by ambulances, or in many countries, developing countries, of course, not taken by ambulances, been taken in taxis or on motorbikes to the hospital. They have brain injury. Now, how much will one corticosteroid matter if you administered that in the ED within 8 hours of the injury? What it may do, it may help. So, why people ask this? Well, some doctors infuse this, give an infusion of methylprednisolone on admission of the patient. Those who use the steroid believe it's effective. They believe it to be effective. This belief has been based on clinical insight and expectations, but the researchers said there's actually not much evidence that shows how effective is this drug? How good is it? So, epidemiological studies are done to test whether the belief should be regarded as fact. That's why you do it. Is the belief should be regarded as knowledge. Because this belief, this practice, in 2/3 of all emergency departments in the United States administered methylprednisolone for people with TBI, traumatic brain injury. Now, sorry. So, the steroids might reduce the death rate by 3%. 3% doesn't seem much, but could be significant. Now, that may not seem much, but it's about the same as administering aspirin after AMI. Now, that's routine. One of the first things you would do, administer aspirin. Or streptokinase after a cardiac arrest. Around 3% benefit. Very, very cheap. So, they thought, right, well, we'll test out to see. We'll do a massive study. And, of course, it cost millions of dollars funded by the Wellcome Trust to test out how good this drug was. They did a randomised trial. Now, Philip will take you through all these designs, but of course you've got backgrounds in experimental sciences anyway. Some of you'll see this is basically an experiment. In the first part, they targeted 20,000 people, but the first half of the trial was 5,000 people got the methylprednisolone and 5,000 didn't. Can you imagine how hard this is to do, this type of research? In 49 countries, I think, I've got the stat there somewhere, so many countries in 200 and something hospitals. How hard is it to do this? This is people coming in with traumatic brain injury into an emergency department. And your experimental protocol is to give one person a placebo and the next person the drug. One person placebo, next person the drug. How much presence of mind as a doctor do you need to be able to carry that off? It's incredible. The amount of training that's behind that. This is a very large study. That's why it was published in The Lancet and journals like that. And then they followed up and they looked to see what happened to the patients. Very few people were lost. A 6 months follow-up. Is the person alive? Did they suffer complications? And do they, have they got ongoing disability? Come on. There we go. There's the randomisation. Right. The completed trial was 10,000. Now, they were halfway through. They completed 10,000. And then what they did was, because it's so expensive, after 10,000, a separate committee of people, not the scientists involved themselves, but a data monitoring committee said, okay, we've been doing this for some years, let's open up the data set without the researchers seeing it, because it's a blinded trial, and let's have a look. And if there's evidence that this is really very good, then you don't need to do the next 10,000, right? So they did that, and they produced these forest plots. And you're probably, I don't know, do you understand forest plots? All right. What this means is, if it's to the right of this line of 1, it means that the problem is worse. And what they found was, after 10,000 people, that more people died who received the drug than received placebo. The drug, which is used in 2/3 of all emergency departments in the United States, was more likely to kill the person. And they were more likely to have seizures, epileptic seizures. So, of course, the Data Monitoring Committee went, whoa, hang on a minute, immediately reported the results to the researchers and found that the effects of there were more complications from brain injury as well as the deaths. The standard clinical practice in 2/3 of the departments in the US and many others was to use this drug. Oh, sorry about this. The belief was very strong. Now, of course, it was immediately stopped. So in all of the leading medical journals in the world, in the Journal of the American Medical Association and all the European medical journals and Indian medical journals, said if you're using corticosteroid for a traumatic brain injury patient, stop. And so it pretty much stopped immediately. That was an unexpected outcome from this research. A very useful one. And the researchers, did their best with that. Of course, the problem is that the problem remains. Damn it. Okay. The problem remains. So, of course, there's still so many people die from traumatic brain injury. There's another option. It's called a drug called tranexamic acid. And that's a synthetic derivative of amino acid lysine. And it's used to treat, prevent excessive blood loss during surgery. And the idea was, well, maybe if it was administered to TBI patients at the point of they were picked up by the ambulance or where they were entered the emergency department, maybe this would be effective. So they set out to do another trial. So many patients in so many hospitals were included in this trial. 274 hospitals. The coordination of this is it's a massive scale. There's almost never a study as complex as this one. 20,000 patients. Again, a randomized trial design. Now, this was the initial results. 15%, the study of trauma patients in 40 countries. 20,000 adults, 3,000 died, 15%. Bleeding was a primary cause. So in those bars, so you can see that the bleeding, which is the bar, so in the first day after the injury, most people were most likely to die. And the second day after injury and third day after injury. And you can see that deaths from bleeding mainly occurred in the first and second day. What they published in the Lancet from this was that the tranexamic acid injection reduced deaths from bleeding and overall risk of death, of deaths from all causes. So basically, any cause of death was reduced and deaths from bleeding were reduced significantly. Clearly, had a very practical applications for treatment. So again, the same researchers introduced this change to hospital practice, and the pre-hospital emergency care in ambulance services was changed as well on the basis of this trial. And the best results occur when it's administered immediately at the scene. Further research is necessary, however, because there's a lot of doubt about, for example, in Australia, Emergency Services Australia said, "Thank you very much. We think your paper's interesting, your research in 274 hospitals in 40 countries, but in Australia we don't need it because our pre-hospital care is excellent. In our context, we don't need it." And the same was said in the UK and in some other countries. Okay, most of this is in developing countries. It's fine, thanks. And they didn't apply it. And then they said, oh, what we should do is do our own studies of tranexamic acid. And there's been some controversy as to whether or not, if you rely on this one cheap treatment, that maybe you won't implement other types of pharmaceutical treatments soon after injury. There's been some debate about this in the literature. So they decided to do yet another trial. So the CRASH-3 trial is currently on, And by July 2018, so nearly 8 months ago, there were 11,000 patients enrolled. Now, my point is, one, it's a dramatic example where you don't get many studies of that scale. What this study has done is this type of epidemiological research contributes directly to saving lives. If this had not been done, this whole crash effort, if the researchers had never come up with it, many people would have died from the original treatment with the corticosteroid and continued to be killed by the treatment. And many more people would have died had they not tested out the tranexamic acid. So this type of research, while epidemiological, when taken at scale, can affect the lives of thousands and thousands of people, which is a use of health science which, if you're a clinician, you get to treat individual patients. You get to see groups of people, perhaps, and smaller numbers of people. And while you can do really effective work, it's not at scale of this type of work here. The problem still remains. I also took this one in India, and you just